Hey everybody, thanks for stopping by for episode 2 of my video blog. As you can see, I am no longer in a hotel room in Florida. Instead, I am back in the fabulous city of Las Vegas in my home, in my office. I still wanted to go over what happened down in Florida, but wanted to do it with a slightly better setup, better camera, that kind of stuff. So as there were some complaints, and they were fairly legitimate, about how low of quality the first shots were. I'd hoped that they would turn out better using my phone, but they just ended up not being that great. So I wanted to reshoot it and give it a better look. So here it is, episode 2, in which I'm going to go over the ending of my 3500. So made day 2 at about 50,000 in chips. I was sitting pretty decently as is going into big blind 1200. On day 2, walked up to my table and saw my starting draw, and it ended up being pretty tough. It was like all younger guys, which anytime I see a bunch of younger guys, and some of them I don't really recognize, but I could tell that they were all either younger locals, which could be decent, or younger Europeans, which were likely to be very good high stakes regs. And from what I could tell, most of them were European and thus very good high stakes regs. So for day 2 of a very soft 3500, it ended up being a very difficult day 2, sadly enough. However, luckily for me, I only ended up being on that table for a very short time period, as the table ended up being one of the first few tables to break. However, while on that table, I ended up getting to play a couple of hands. And this was a main hand that I played on it. So it's big blind 1200, still playing around 50,000 effective. Folds to mid position 1. Who at the time I didn't know who he was, but he actually ended up being someone that I ended up paying out a decent amount with over the next 4 or 5 days of the trip. His name is Gerald, or Harold. Is very hard pronunciation on it, but essentially it's Gerald, and essentially he's one of the Germans. He's part of that crew. A very, very, very skilled player. Really great guy. Had a lot of fun hanging out with them. So folds him in mid position 1. He opens to 2600. Hijack, who I believe was one of the few recreational players on the table, maybe the only recreational player on the table. Hijack calls. I have ace jack off on the button, playing about 50k effective, and I 3-bet to 8700. And going to 8700 here is actually a little bit small because of the caller in between. Without the collar, this is actually a very large 3-bet. But with the collar, this is a slightly small sizing, at least for me personally. As, when I size it, the sizing, if MP1 calls, it's pretty good likelihood that the hijack will call as well. However, because I suspected that the opener was a very skilled high stakes reg, I wanted to have ace jack off as my 5-bet bluff. So I decided to slightly downside so I could 3 to 5 it, which I would also do with my very strong hand. So I thought that going slightly small would be a good thing to do. Anyways, so I 3-bet to 8700, Gerald and MP1 calls, and the hijack folds. Flop is ace king 7 rainbow with 1 spade. I do not have a spade in my hand. He checks, and I continuation bet 7,000, and he calls. So this board texture is a pretty good board for me. And while I have top pair and a decent kicker, my hand is a fairly vulnerable top pair, as while there are certainly worse hands I'm going to be getting value from, like ace 8 suited, ace 9 suited, ace 10 suited, ace jack off. I block a lot of those, and ace jack I'm tying. And he certainly can still have ace queen in his range. Also, he can have a hand like pocket 7s. However, I'm also getting some and he can have like ace 7 suited, and maybe he's peeling his suited wheel aces. So I guess there are a decent amount of aces that I'm getting value from. And I'm also, of course, getting value from king queen suited, king jack suited, and probably king 10 suited due to how small the sizing I made. So I would be fairly surprised if he would fold any of those to my 1/3 continuation bet. It's in part why I go so small, to make sure I keep his range as wide as possible and to get as much value as possible from his range. He can also have some fairly light peels, like maybe 9-10 suited with double backdoor straight draws and backdoor flush draw, especially backdoor royal draw, straight flush draw. He can also have like queen 10 suited, jack 10 suited, queen jack suited. So there are a decent amount of hands that my small c bet gets value from. So on the turn three of spades, while I still very likely have the best hand, when I barrel this, a lot of his range is going to fold. Like if he still had a hand like king 10, king jack, king queen, almost all of them are going to fold, even if I size it fairly small. So the stuff that I'm trying to target on turn to get value from, anything that he might have turned a flush draw on, and of course all of his ace X that he might decide to call again on. But if he did have like ace deuce, ace 4, ace 5, I would expect him now to fold, or ace 6, and I would still expect him to call ace 10, ace 9, and maybe ace 8, and of course ace jack and ace queen. So there really aren't that many hands that I can get value from, but it's still really important for me to bet here to protect all my bluffs. So because of that, I decide to barrel. And when I do barrel, I actually made a misclick. When I went to grab chips, an extra 5K chip stuck when I went down to grab it. So I bet 18,000 when I meant to bet 13,000. And 18,000 isn't a terrible sizing here, but I wanted to go slightly smaller as I was planning on folding to a jam, as I didn't think he would have necessarily enough bluffs in game. And if I am betting 13,000, or if I'm betting 18,000 instead of 13,000, that's just an extra 5,000 in chips that I lose when he jams. And I don't necessarily think that it really helps me a lot by betting slightly larger for value there. But I don't know, it's not necessarily terrible, but I did strongly prefer to go smaller. So I bet 13,000, he tanks for a little while and folds. So after this hand, maybe like 5 to 10 minutes later, I ended up getting moved, and I was very, very happy to get moved, obviously, as the rest of the tables around me were looking very, very good. However, I get to my new table, and while it's not a bad table, it's a pretty tough table still considering. I've got Tyler Kenny on my right, Blake Bond, Jonathan Little across the table. John's actually someone that I was staying at the Seminole Hard Rock with, someone who knows my game very well. He and I were discussing hands a lot, so it's generally having someone that you know very, very well at the same table as you in a supposedly soft event, generally not that great of a thing. There were a couple other regs as well. However, there were like 3 to 4 recreational players. So while it was a slightly bad table in the sense that I knew someone very well at it, and I know Blake pretty well as well. He's another fellow professional from Minnesota, so he and I have seen each other a lot, play together a lot, but he and I don't really discuss hands, and while he's definitely very skilled and good reg to have, it's not as big of an issue as someone who knows me very well and very personally. The other regs I didn't really recognize that well, and / don't really remember who they were, but there were enough recreational players at the table. That was a much better table than the previous table. So I got to the table and ended up chipping up almost immediately. At big blind 1600, under the gun, 1 jammed, 15 big blinds, folds me in the small blind. I pocket 10s and get it in, and I win the flip against the shovers king queen. So I busted one of the recreational players that I didn't really know. This is essentially the hand that I bust on. So at big blind 1600, Blake opens to 3500 under gun 1. And for those of you who don't know how Blake plays, Blake is very, 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 very aggressive. Hyper aggro. So he opens 3500 UTG1. Tyler Kenny 3 bets in mid position 2 to 8700. And I am on Tyler's direct left, and I have pocket kings. So this is kind of a bit of a situation in the sense that I think both options are very viable. I can either cold 4-bet and snap off his jam for, we were about, I want to say I had like 95,000, he had about 80,000. So I can cold 4-bet and call off his jam, or I can kind of cold call. But I see some issues with cold calling in the sense that this is a really good spot for me to 4-bet bluff, and I do want to protect those 4-bet bluffs in my range. Thus, I should technically just always cold 4-bet my strong value hands. But the issues I have with cold 4-betting in this exact scenario is that, or why we could actually consider calling here instead of cold 4-betting, is that with how aggressive Blake is, Tyler should probably be 3-betting him very, very light, a very high percentage of the time, and just applying lots of pressure. And the upside of cold calling this 3-bet, just calling without having been the opener, The main upside of doing that is that it kind of caps my range, as they wouldn't necessarily expect me to cold call here. I can maybe induce a light 4-bet behind or induce Blake to light 4-bet. But I kind of also thought in game that both Blake and Tyler would be aware of the fact that I'm capable of cold 4-betting light, so I just 4-bet. So Tyler had 3-bet to 8,700. So I 4-bet to 21,600. Folds back to him. He tanks for a while and jams. I, of course, snap it off and run into pocket queen. So I was in amazing shape. I was in amazing shape on the ace-7-6 flop. I was in amazing shape on the ace turn, and I was essentially Bustoville on the queen 2 outer river. So it's about 120 big blind river 2 outer on day 2. So that sucked. That was less than optimal for sure. But while I did end up busting that, I did have the 10K to play within, I believe it was the next day. So I was still in pretty high hopes and looking forward to playing the 10K. Definitely one of the biggest, better value 10Ks of the year, and was looking forward to it for sure. So this is how I busted day 2 of the World Poker Tour Seminole Hard Rock $3,500 event. And I put myself into a great situation. I played great, and while I obviously ended up getting a disappointing result, I was happy with how I played and was certainly in high hopes going into the next tournament. Thank you guys for watching this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know if you have any thoughts, questions, concerns, criticisms, anything that's very legitimate. I will reply to it, and thank you for watching. Best of luck at the tables.